However, there was one publisher. His name was E.B. Grandin. E.B. Grandin had a small little book bindery store right on Main Street in Palmyra. E.B. Grandin, he had other businesses on the side. He ran a newspaper out of that little kind of shop setup he had. But you'd say he did other things. He's a butcher in town, he's other things, and so it wasn't like this was an aside business, but definitely he had other things going for himself. E.B. Grandin had been approached by people in town and told not to. However, E.B. Grandin could see a financial advantage to being the publisher. The financial advantage came when the well-to-do farmer, Martin Harris, agreed that he would put up 150 plus acres as kind of a security, and that if a contractual arrangement could be made, if the printer, then publisher, meaning Grandin, if the books hadn't sold, he hadn't been paid back, that then the farm would need to be sold, and any way he looked at it, Grandin's cost would be covered. With that, the publisher Grandin now agreed that he would begin publishing the Book of Mormon. The publishing went forward, but you would say for the publishing there was some concern about we don't want to take the original manuscript that mostly Martin had been the scribe, and so that Oliver had been the scribe, and so Oliver was asked to make a printer's copy of the Book of Mormon. So you get the original manuscript will be left behind. In other words, Joseph had learned a big lesson on that loss of the 116-page manuscript, and so this time he's saying to Oliver, make a copy, and it would then be called the printer's copy. The printer's copy would then be taken to the publisher on pretty much a daily basis, and from that, type would be set. Now, once the type was set, you get the process, an elongated process, begins to move forward. Finally, on March 26 of 1830, E.B. Grandin will now advertise in his newspaper that the Book of Mormon is now for sale. The cost of that book will be $1.25. Now, with that book coming out, you can imagine that it caused great excitement. Today, if a new book comes out, unless it's an instant bestseller, within 3 weeks you know that it's going to be a success or nobody noticed. But a book coming out, 500 pages, in Western New York, where you'd say, this is the first, most unusual. Everybody has something to say about it, particularly as it has the issue with gold plates and an angel then very much involved with it. The question was, how did Joseph Smith do it? In other words, how could possibly somebody who had had no more than an elementary education? In fact, the church owns the 3 books that Joseph had used while attending school. You'd say one is about grammar, one is very basic arithmetic, some kind of math, and the other has a lot to do with poems and prose. So you'd look, and the big question is, well, how in the world could Joseph have done this book, especially when you've got the main scribe, Oliver Cowdery, but we can actually name about 12 people that will assist him, and each one of the scribes will indicate that Joseph never said, read me back the last line, or I'd like to change that to this. And you realize that means during the months that he was doing it, he's obviously going to stop to sleep, to eat, and various other family obligations and things with friends. The question is, how did he do it? One of the theories that was popular as the book first came out was that Joseph Smith suffered from epileptic fits. Now, if any of you have suffered from the malady, or you've seen someone that's had to deal in their lives with that kind of problem, you realize that anyone going through a fit, they were suggesting that Joseph Smith had some kind of curtain between himself and his scribe, and the reason being is because he didn't want them to see he was having a fit. Well, if you've seen someone in that state, you realize there's no way that they are going to say a coherent paragraph, let alone be able to speak consistently through a 500-page book that obviously will still be in print, many, many years later, and be one of the most popular books literally on the entire earth today. And so that theory, we would need to conclude, has no validity. Another theory that was prominent at that time was that Joseph Smith was a dreamer, that he'd actually go to sleep and he would have a dream, and the next morning he would be behind the veil and he would merely tell his scribe the dream, and thus you get the Book of Mormon. Well, you realize that that's a crazy thought. Perhaps many of you have dreamed as I have. I've had dreams in which I wake up and the dream was actually a good one and I want to finish it, and I go back to sleep hoping that I'll be able to catch part 2 of the dream, but unsuccessfully. And you would say, for Joseph Smith, what are the chances that he could dream about a people that lived in 600 BC when he lives in the 19th century? He's dreaming about a people that live in 600 BC that go all the way to 421 AD, and then you put towards the end people living way back during the time of the Tower of Babel. And you'd look and you'd say, and to make it consistent, just roll it on out and never say, what happened, repeat me what happened yesterday, oh yes, here's where I left off. I think most of us would say, that's a crazy theory. Obviously, that one doesn't hold water. Another theory that was prevalent during Joseph's time was that Joseph had a stolen manuscript, and that Joseph had stolen this manuscript written by a man whose name was Solomon Spaulding. Indeed, Solomon Spaulding claimed that he had written a manuscript and that it was stolen, and so the conclusion was, it's young Joseph Smith that stole it, and the reason that he has a veil between himself and his scribe is because he's merely reading what someone else wrote, and he's marking where he left off. Therefore, he never has to say, read me back the last line, because he actually knows. Well, that theory literally caught on, and people talked about it for decades, that's how the Book of Mormon came to be. However, in the early 20th century, the Spaulding manuscript, this lost manuscript, was found and identified. Truly, it was the Spaulding manuscript. Today, that manuscript is located in a place called Oberlin College there in Ohio. Now, I've had an occasion to go see the manuscript, and they have it in their archives section. You have to put on some kind of gloves to be able to touch it. The pages are very brittle, and you carefully, with someone looking over your shoulder, you can then look through the pages. What was the Spaulding manuscript about? Well, the Spaulding manuscript is about crusaders on their way to fight a war in today what we would call Israel. They are on this holy crusade, but unfortunately for them, they never make it over to then this old world, what in the scriptures sometimes referred to as Judea or Palestine, but instead these crusaders, these army people, they arrive all the way to the Americas. And in the Americas, they have amazing adventures, which all are focused on romance. So you'd say the Spaulding manuscript is a romance story between the Crusaders now and Native American maidens So, if you were to compare and contrast his manuscript with the Book of Mormon, you'd be hard put to find any kind of romance in the Book of Mormon, anything that even begins to rival the Spalding manuscript. In other words, the Book of Mormon is a witness for Jesus Christ. It is not a witness of some kind of romance between ancient people falling in love, out of love, and all of that. Well, okay. Another theory that was prominent at the time was that Joseph Smith was an amazing genius. Now, okay, I would be hard put to say anything against Joseph. I've had a chance to read all of his words. I have been teaching about the prophet Joseph Smith for literally decades. I've walked where Joseph walked. I've actually lived in various locations for different periods of time where he has been. After looking at all of his words, after studying literally people who knew him, I could say that Joseph was a wonderful man. He was a prophet. But when it comes to genius, when you looked at him personally at this time in his life, you would say, oh, Joseph, you need a spell check. You know, there's a reason he's going to need a scribe. You know, he's not like me, and perhaps not like you, who has spent many hours listening to teachers, having them correct your work, you know, making sure you spelled right, your sentences were grammatically correct. And so as I look at Joseph at this time, I would have to say he was a translator. Okay. Another theory that caught wind when the book came out had to do with the title page of the Book of Mormon. If you have seen a copy of the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon, you will find on the title page, you know, it says the Book of Mormon and all of that, but when it comes down to who did it, Joseph will then say he is the author and proprietor. Now notice, that looks very much like he's saying, I wrote this. I made this up on my own. In fact, I had an experience, obviously, you know, century plus later. I'm living in a small community, and I'm serving in the church, and I have an older woman that comes up to me and says that she can no longer help with the nursery-age children, that she is leaving the church. And so I said to her, leave the church, never leave the kids. I go, we could never replace you. In other words, she was like a grandma to those kids. They loved her, and I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't imagine who could ever take her place. And so I says, come on, you know, I go, what's up? And I go, why are you leaving the church? And she said, well, I've seen an original copy of the Book of Mormon. And I go, well, me too. What's up? And she said, well, I don't want to ruin your testimony too, but did you know that in the first, on the first page, title page, it says that Joseph writes that he is the author and proprietor? And I said, oh, I do know that. And I said, well, how did you know that? And she said, well, some of my kind of anti-Mormon friends talked to me about it. And I said, oh, why don't you invite your friends to come to lunch at my house? And I said, you know, if my food doesn't kill them, perhaps the conversation will. Well, okay, here comes the friends. They are all armed. They're just sure that they're going to destroy me, as they were attempting to destroy my great friend. Well, after dinner, I said, well, okay, let's talk about this. And I got out a copy of the original Book of Mormon. And I said, you know, you're right. You look at it, it does say Joseph Smith, Jr., author and proprietor, but let's turn over the page. You know, you got to read the whole thing, don't you? So we turned over the page, and when we turned over the page, you're going to see that Joseph says, according to the laws of the state of New York, and this is right, that in order to get a copyright, in other words, to protect the book so that it cannot be published by others, in order to get a copyright, the only way you could get a copyright at that time to protect the book was you couldn't say that you were an editor, you couldn't say you were a compiler, You couldn't say you were a translator because they wouldn't give you a copyright. But if you said you were the author and proprietor, you got a copyright, you could protect your work. But then Joseph then writes, I'm not the author, I'm not the proprietor. He goes, I'm the translator. And he said, this work is then given me by an angel of God, and I translated then these plates. Well, everyone, you then look and you'd say, so then what was the Book of Mormon? In other words, if Joseph didn't dream it, if he wasn't this amazing genius in his youth, if he wasn't then author proprietor, if he didn't steal a manuscript and all of the others, then how in the world did he do it? For Joseph Smith, he said very plainly, he said, I translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. For Emma Smith, years later, Joseph died in 44, she's about to die in 1879, and very close to the end of her life, her son, Joseph Smith III, comes to her. And as he comes to her, he wants to ask her questions. In other words, Mom, you're close to death, kind of like deathbed repentance. And tell us what you think about the Book of Mormon, and really, how in the world did Dad do this? And for Joseph Smith III, he wants to know, did Dad have a manuscript? She assures him no. In other words, Emma's a cleaner. She would have seen it. She would have found it somewhere. No manuscript. And the son then keeps pressing his aged mother. And finally, she then says, son, your father translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. I know that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God.